Between 1955 and 1975, Vietnam was engulfed in a brutal civil war that eventually drew in foreign powers like the U.S. The war normalized unimaginable horrors, landscape devastation, and piercing screams became routine for the Vietnamese, Americans, and their allies. Join us as we delve into the darkest chapters of this era and show you 20 of the most chilling practices that became normalized during the Vietnam War. Number 20. Agent Orange. Chemical warfare has been used throughout history, from ancient times to modern conflicts. In the Vietnam War, the U.S. military used a chemical weapon that was supposed to destroy the enemy's environment, but ended up destroying much more. This weapon was Agent Orange, a deadly combination of herbicides and defoliants that was sprayed over Vietnam from 1962 to 1971. The U.S. hoped to strip the Viet Cong of their natural hiding places and food sources by killing the lush forests and crops. You might be wondering why it is called Agent Orange. The name comes from the orange stripe on the barrels that stored the herbicide, which was one of several color-coded agents used in Vietnam. But they didn't know that Agent Orange also contained dioxin, one of the most harmful substances ever made. Dioxin can cause cancer, birth defects, neurological disorders, and other serious health problems. Millions of people in Vietnam and thousands of American veterans were exposed to Agent Orange and suffered from its effects. The most heavily sprayed areas saw full-scale environmental devastation. Lush green jungles were transformed into barren wastelands. Defective vegetation turned black and died rapidly after exposure. Crops such as rice, cassava, and corn were decimated. Areas of heavy spraying became denuded and eroded. The scale of destruction was immense, with over 3.5 million acres affected. Entire ecosystems were irreparably damaged by the indiscriminate use of this herbicide. Even more chilling were the severe health repercussions. Vietnamese civilians directly exposed to Agent Orange suffered from skin irritations, birth defects, cancers, and other illnesses. High concentrations of toxic dioxin in Agent Orange accumulated in the food chain, causing intergenerational health problems. Alarmingly high rates of congenital disabilities and developmental issues appeared in children born in sprayed zones years later. American troops were also afflicted by devastating side effects. Veterans returned home with mysterious ailments that were eventually tied to Agent Orange exposure. These included nerve disorders, skin conditions, liver damage, and various forms of cancer. It took years of struggle before these Agent Orange syndromes were officially recognized as war-related conditions by the U.S. government. Many veterans faced inadequate health care and support while dealing with the fallout. Number 19. Children of the Dust. The Vietnam War saw widespread intermingling between American troops and Vietnamese civilians. This led to thousands of children being born of mixed heritage to Vietnamese mothers, who were often derided as children of the dust. Their plight underscores the social rifts and inequalities that simmered beneath the surface during the conflict. These children of mixed race faced severe discrimination in Vietnamese society. They were considered outcasts and viewed with suspicion and contempt for their American lineage. Called booby or children of the dust, they were marginalized for purportedly embodying the invasion of Vietnamese sovereignty. Mothers of these children also endured shame and stigma. Many faced abandonments by their families, being cast out for supposedly sullying the reputation of their village or family line. The hostile societal attitude compelled numerous women to give up their children, leaving them in orphanages or on the streets. By the end of the war, there were tens of thousands of homeless children of the dust scattered across South Vietnam. They lived in abject poverty, begging or doing menial labor to survive. Some older children banded together in makeshift gangs for protection. Without parents or guardians, they were extremely vulnerable to exploitation. In the lead-up to the fall of Saigon in 1975, the situation grew even bleaker. The pending Viet Cong victory spurred vicious hatred towards those tainted by American paternity. Children of mixed heritage were targeted for brutal retaliation in the closing days of the war, seen as symbols of the occupying force. Number 18. War Dogs. The U.S. military deployed over 4,000 dogs in the Vietnam War that were critical for scouting, sentry duty, mine detection, and bomb sniffing. Labrador Retrievers, German Shepherds, and Doberman Pinschers made up the most common breeds that, as war dogs, saved countless lives and helped locate enemy forces. Paired with human handlers with whom they forged tight bonds, the dogs' acute senses augmented security and reconnaissance capabilities in Vietnam's harsh terrain. Their unique mental and physical abilities allowed them to serve with distinction, despite the dangers and difficulties facing both soldiers and canines. Before deployment, the dogs received specialized training to build stamina, obedience, and skill in their wartime roles. But their short life expectancy in combat, just months on average, took a toll on the handlers who saw their canine partners sacrifice their lives. Over 250 war dogs died in action. Beyond fulfilling their duties, the sensitive animals offered comfort and canine companionship to their handlers. Stroking a dog's fur soothed many anxiety-ridden soldiers traversing remote outposts and battle zones. Their presence provided reassuring normalcy amid the madness of war. Number 17. Psychological warfare operations. Among the many battles of the Vietnam War, there was also a psychological war for the heart and mind of the people. Both sides relied heavily on propaganda and psychological operations aimed at manipulating popular sentiment and damaging enemy morale. The extensive use of these covert tactics provides a chilling window into the depths of deception perpetrated throughout the conflict. The U.S. military deployed propaganda on an enormous scale in pursuit of victory. Airdropped leaflets, loudspeaker broadcasts, and black ops all formed part of a relentless psychological campaign. Civilians in Viet Cong-controlled zones were subject to propaganda efforts portraying the Americans as their liberators and protectors. Meanwhile, disinformation spread among enemy forces and tried to foster distrust, dissent, and defection. The Viet Cong engaged in their own psychological operations against American troops. Misinformation was used to lure units into ambushes. Booby traps were rigged with toy whistles or trinkets that mimicked sounds appealing to curious young soldiers. Propagandists also targeted the American home front, hoping to undermine public support for the war. Among the most chilling U.S. PSYOPs tactics were the so-called wandering soul recordings played during night missions in the Vietnamese jungle. These ghostly audio tapes exploited local beliefs about ancestors to unnerve and frighten Viet Cong fighters. Ethereal voices mimicked the spirits of the dead, warning listeners not to follow the same fate. The eerie recordings added a terrifying supernatural dimension to conventional military operations. Number 16. Helicopters. The Vietnam War saw extensive use of helicopters as tools of mobility, firepower, and logistics. As the jungle terrain hindered ground transport, the helicopter took on immense strategic importance for U.S. forces. The iconic Huey became a ubiquitous presence from the air, changing the dynamics of combat. However, helicopters required courageous crews and also proved vulnerable, often coming under intense fire. Armed gunship helicopters offered vital air support, providing cover for troops and hammering enemy formations. Rocket pods and heavy machine guns gave helicopter gunner crews tremendous suppressive fire capability. Gunships like the Cobra could decimate hostile targets while staying safely out of range. This advantage helped offset the mobility of Viet Cong guerrillas. Transport helicopters rapidly shuttled troops and supplies wherever needed, offering operational flexibility. Instead of long marches on foot, soldiers could quickly move via air assault to strike objectives. The extensive use of helicopters in Vietnam greatly expanded their role in modern warfare. But it came at a heavy human price, with over 5,000 choppers destroyed and thousands killed in action. Their immense contribution was central but costly, changing combat while pushing the limits of available technology. The helicopter's rise underscored war's ability to rapidly accelerate innovation under pressure for both good and terrible purposes. Number 15. Ear necklaces. Among the darkest chapters of the Vietnam War were the atrocities committed by Tiger Force, an elite long-range recon team which earned infamy for its gruesome practices from 1967 to 1968. During this time, they are believed to have killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. The darkest practice was their signature war trophies. Necklaces strung with severed human ears revealed the depths of brutality reached by some American soldiers. Tiger Force's months-long trail of terror against unarmed villagers, farmers, and other non-combatants included torture and murder. They beheaded civilians, mutilated corpses, and cut off the ears of slain Vietnamese. The collected ears were threaded onto string to create gruesome necklaces worn by members of the unit. Besides inflicting horrific suffering, these evil acts sabotaged any possibility of winning civilian trust. The atrocities committed by Tiger Force were investigated by the Army in 1971, but no one was ever charged with a crime. The case was eventually buried in the military archives. Number 14, long-range reconnaissance patrols. Long-range reconnaissance patrols, or LRRPs, were small, heavily armed teams that went deep behind enemy lines to gather intelligence during the Vietnam War. Comprised of 5 to 6 men, these units faced constant danger with limited supplies in remote jungle locations. LRRPs relied on stealth and specialized tactics to observe enemy activity and call in airstrikes or artillery fire on targets. Their high-risk missions produced invaluable intel, but required remarkable resilience and skill. Alone in hostile territory, LRRP teams had to be vigilant against detection. They selected concealed observation posts and minimized radio contact to avoid revealing their presence. Booby traps, snipers, and ambushes threatened them even when not engaging the enemy directly. LRRPs wore camouflage, moved quietly, and built well-hidden night defensive positions to survive behind the lines. The challenging conditions placed enormous physical and mental strain on LRRP troops. The humid jungle environment bred disease, parasites, and infections if even minor wounds were neglected. Food and clean water were limited, and operational rations formed their only sustenance for weeks in the bush. Stress took a toll in the form of exhaustion, malnourishment, and psychological trauma from constant danger. Still, LRRPs endured these hardships as the risks of their trade. However, hundreds of LRRP team members perished in the course of their high-casualty operations. Those surviving these covert missions returned hardened by the experience, having repeatedly faced death deep in enemy land. Number 13, Military Assistance Command. Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, or simply MACV-SOG, was a covert special operations unit that conducted classified reconnaissance and direct action missions during the Vietnam War. Comprising Army Special Forces, Navy SEALs, and Air Commandos, SOG carried out highly dangerous operations beyond the official war zones, along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and in Laos and Cambodia. SOG teams faced extremely high casualty rates given their perilous missions. SOG's main tasks were information gathering and disruption of enemy logistics. Small 3 to 5 man teams parachuted, helicoptered, or patrolled into North Vietnam and neighboring areas to scout installations and track troop movements. Other SOG missions aimed to rescue downed pilots, take prisoners, or sabotage supply lines through ambushes and demolitions. SOG troops developed almost superhuman endurance and vigilance to survive. They endured weeks-long patrols in grueling terrain, moving mostly at night to avoid detection. Malaria, malnutrition, parasites, and infections were constant threats, as were wildlife hazards. Many perished in firefights and helicopter shootdowns before they could safely return to base. For 8 years, SOG conducted highly classified operations that altered the course of the Vietnam War. They rescued downed air crews, tapped enemy communications, planted sensors to track troop movements, and mined roads to ambush convoys. But this dangerous work saw over 2,000 SOG members killed in action or missing by 1972. Their valor came at a steep price, with SOG veterans estimating casualty rates between 50 to 100%. And the classified nature of their operations meant their sacrifices went unrecognized for decades. Number 12, Dust-Off Crews. The iconic helicopter stories of the Vietnam War would be incomplete without the courageous dust-off crews who risked their lives evacuating wounded personnel. These air ambulance teams entered hot landing zones under fire to retrieve the injured, getting them speedy medical care. Saving countless lives, dust-offs exemplified selfless heroism. After major battles or ambushes, dust-off choppers raced to extract the wounded before it was too late. Landings in uncleared zones amidst ongoing gunfights pushed pilots, crew chiefs, and medical personnel to their limits. Yet many volunteered for dust-off duty, dedicated to rushing into harm's way when others desperately needed help. To maximize survival, dust-off crews developed specialized techniques like the steep contour flight for quickly slipping into and out of dangerous LZs. Under intense fire, they disregarded incredible risks to snatch wounded soldiers and Marines from the battlefield. Many gave their lives this way, shot down or killed by ground fire doing their mercy missions. Medical personnel on dust-offs performed life-saving aid while under extreme duress. Over 900,000 personnel were aeromedically evacuated in Vietnam, most via dust-off. This incredible feat was only possible through the combined efforts of pilots, aircrew, and medical teams who volunteered for the air ambulance service. Their ability to rapidly evacuate the injured by helicopter was revolutionary, reducing deaths from wounds sustained in combat. The dedication of dust-off crews represents some of the Vietnam War's most profound acts of humanity and valor. Number 11. Underground tunnels and booby traps. The Viet Cong maintained a vast underground tunnel network throughout the Vietnam War zone that allowed their guerrilla fighters to move undetected and launch surprise attacks against American forces. Meanwhile, thousands of clever booby traps set by the VC maimed U.S. troops and instilled constant fear. The tunnels and traps were pivotal to the enemy's strategy. This sprawling maze of tunnels was dug by hand under American bases and across rural areas. Entire Viet Cong field hospitals, bunkers, storage depots, and living quarters existed below ground. Tunnels allowed the transport of troops and supplies unseen, enabling the elusive tactics of the VC. Through a series of trapdoors, the VC would disappear after ambushes and evade U.S. sweeps. Booby traps complemented the tunnels by inflicting physical and psychological harm. All manner of vines, grenades, pits, spikes, and explosives were rigged to kill and wound. Tripwires activated swinging machetes and log traps that crushed victims. Punji stake pits lined with sharpened bamboo spikes awaited victims at the bottom, delivering gruesome impalement wounds. Grenades rigged to wires could instantly shred a passing soldier. Swinging log traps crushed legs. Pressure plungers set off hidden mines. Each step through the terrain held the possibility of instant catastrophe. Choosing paths became fraught with peril. Booby traps served to exhaust and terrorize U.S. forces. Number 10. Jungle warfare. The dense rainforests and sweltering heat of Vietnam created an extremely challenging battlefield environment for U.S. forces. Adapting to jungle warfare against an enemy adept at using the tropical landscape for concealment and surprise attacks pushed American troops to their physical and mental limits. The unfamiliar terrain shaped the war in Vietnam, with the environment as much of an adversary as the Viet Cong itself. Nearly impenetrable vegetation, muddy conditions, and tropical diseases posed constant hardships and dangers. Poor visibility in triple canopy jungles hindered orientation and contact with the elusive enemy. Helicopters and air power compensated somewhat by allowing overhead observation and mobility. But on the ground, the jungle remained a terrifying labyrinth full of hidden perils. Camouflage and stealth became vital for U.S. patrols moving through the jungle. Single-file formations reduced the chances of ambush, with lead scout and tail gunner positions critical. Still, the Viet Cong's mastery of the jungle helped them evade pursuers and launch opportunistic assaults. Their jungle tactics exemplified expert exploitation of the environment. Psychological casualties from the conditions were also significant. Sensory deprivation in the jungle's depths, interrupted by sudden violence, took a toll. Stress, fatigue, mental breakdowns, substance abuse, and disciplinary problems emerged widely among troops weathering the jungle environment. Number 9. Tunnel rats. Tunnel rats were American and Australian troops tasked with infiltrating the Viet Cong's vast underground tunnel networks during the Vietnam War. Their perilous job was to clear tunnels of enemies, gather intelligence, and destroy infrastructure. Voluntarily taking on this high-risk subterranean assignment, tunnel rats exemplified remarkable bravery. Claustrophobic, lightless tunnels full of traps, poisonous critters, and enemies were the terrifying workplace of tunnel rats. Descending alone into these black holes with just a pistol, knife, and flashlight took nerves of steel. Any one of dozens of dangers, booby traps, getting lost, awaiting enemy ambush, could make them a permanent underground tomb. Surviving the alien, confined environment required special mental strength. The absolute focus was essential when creeping through the unknown. The slightest lapse in caution could trigger a trap or stumbling into an enemy. A cool head under fire also kept tunnel rats alive when suddenly engaged in close quarters. Equally vital was a sixth sense for detecting danger. Tunnel rats learned to recognize almost imperceptible signs of foretelling threats and to trust their gut feelings. A faint breeze indicated a connecting tunnel. Disturbed dirt warned of a trap. A small sound or scent hinted at an enemy lurking ahead. Heeding these primal instincts helped keep operators alert. Number 8. Fragging was the disturbing practice of U.S. troops in Vietnam intentionally killing their own officers and NCOs with fragmentation grenades. Typically done when unpopular leaders made decisions perceived to needlessly endanger the lives of their men, fraggings were an ominous sign of breakdowns in military discipline, morale, and the chain of command. By dropping a live grenade into an officer's bunk or quarters, the perpetrators of fraggings could make the murder seem accidental or unattributable. But the intended victim was clear. While exact numbers are unknown, hundreds of suspected fragging incidents underscored factions between leadership and the rank and file emerging amidst the unpopular war. Most fraggings stemmed from frustrations over company policies and the incompetence or overzealousness of leaders. Extended tours of duty on the line also bred resentment when rotating out seemed impossible. Troops forced into combat by leaders detached from the daily mayhem understandably harbored deep hostilities. Drug usage and racial tensions between white officers and Black and Latino enlisted men exacerbated the problem. Fragging appeared concentrated among conscripted soldiers counting the days until departure back home. Draftees seemed quicker to snap under reckless officers with cavalier attitudes about their lives. Number 7. Tiger cages. Amidst the horrors of the Vietnam War, one of the most appalling techniques was the use of medieval-style tiger cages to house Viet Cong prisoners. These cruel confinement cells exposed the brutality and inhumanity that flourished within America's ally, South Vietnam. International condemnation ensued once their evil design was revealed. Tiger cages were basically open-air concrete pits dug into the earth, sometimes partitioned into smaller cells by metal bars. Prisoners endured extreme conditions and torture inside them, with scarce food, overflowing human waste, and rampant disease due to overcrowding. The AO Gang, South Vietnam's secret police, subjected inmates to regular abuse and beatings. The tiger cages originated under French colonial rule, but expanded during the war despite U.S. funding. Media exposure in 1969 spurred global outrage once the appalling conditions came to light. Some members of Congress pushed to withhold aid to South Vietnam, but the cages continued operating until 1974. Up to 30,000 Viet Cong suspects endured confinement in tiger cages at facilities like Con Son Prison. Only a fraction was ever tried or convicted. Random villagers were often arrested and ended up imprisoned for years without charges. Such injustice only swelled the VC's recruiting ranks. Number 6. Napalm use. Among the most horrifying weapons extensively utilized by the U.S. military during the Vietnam War was napalm, an incendiary mixture that clung to targets and scorched human flesh down to the bone. Dropped from aircraft, napalm's jellied gasoline created apocalyptic firestorms and caused incalculable human suffering. Several 100,000 tons of napalm saturated Vietnam between 1965 to 1973, used to defoliate jungles and destroy bunkers, villages, and suspected enemy forces. Even if it missed living targets, napalm's liquid flames splattered over everything nearby. The resulting infernos left behind hellish devastation and disfigured bodies. Strewn by bombs and flamethrowers, when ignited, this petroleum gel burned at over 1,500 Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel. Attempting to extinguish it only made the gel stick more. Many victims were trapped, able to only scream as the liquid fire melted their skin and cooked their organs. Death often came slowly by suffocation or circulatory shock. Large areas of Vietnam, from densely wooded regions to rice farms supporting civilian populations, were ravaged by napalm strikes. Survivors faced gruesome injuries, loss of limbs, and years of excruciating reconstructive surgeries. Napalm's legacy of destroyed landscapes and maimed bodies made it one of the war's most horrifying instruments. Now it's time for today's subscriber pick. The horrors inflicted on soldiers in the Vietnam War were unimaginable. Sadly, many brave men died on the battlefield. Others lived on to recount the horrors they and their colleagues faced. From being literally nailed to trees to crossing unpredictable rivers on fragile bamboo rods, they faced extreme dangers daily. Everything was uncertain for these soldiers. What are your thoughts on war in general? Weigh in with your perspective in the comments below. Number 5. Shell shock. The extreme trauma of combat in Vietnam took a severe psychological toll on many soldiers, leaving haunting scars from what later became known as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. At the time, mental health services were inadequate to address the symptoms commonly called shell shock. But the lingering ghosts of PTSD underscored war's indelible imprint on the minds of its veterans. Sleeplessness, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, and flashbacks afflicted tens of thousands returning stateside. Many used alcohol or drugs to cope with the overbearing memories and anxiety. The nightmares, panic attacks, and readjustment issues stemming from PTSD could persist for years or even lifetimes. Amidst the chaos and bloodshed in Vietnam, constant loss surrounded the soldiers. Seeing friends killed or horribly maimed, experiences unlike anything in civilian life, inflicted deep trauma. Even those not directly in combat felt the war's psychological effects from attacks, casualties, and the overall climate of fear pervading Vietnam. The deficiencies in recognizing and treating psychological scars reflected the limited understanding of PTSD at the time. The stigma surrounding mental health also discouraged sufferers from seeking help as they struggled to reintegrate into society. Many veterans received little meaningful support for their symptoms. Number 4. Gulf of Tonkin Incident. America's full-scale entry into the Vietnam War was based on the Gulf of Tonkin incidents, which were later revealed to be the result of exaggerations, deceptions, and falsehoods. This manipulated intelligence ushered in a decade of disastrous conflict under false pretenses. On August 2, 1964, North Vietnamese torpedo boats allegedly attacked the destroyer USS Maddox in international waters, an incident trumpeted by President Johnson. 2 days later, he announced a second unprovoked attack against U.S. ships that never actually occurred, using the fabricated incident to obtain congressional authority for open warfare. Top administration officials knew the second attack's validity was dubious, but suppressed their doubts to present a unified rationale for retaliation and escalation. Once the watershed Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed, America's military role expanded dramatically from mere assistance to full combat intervention. During the next decade of bloody stalemate, thousands of American lives were lost in Vietnam, along with millions of Vietnamese casualties. The profound costs might have been avoided if the deceit surrounding the Gulf of Tonkin events had been exposed earlier. The false pretext critically impacted public support for the war in the years that followed. Number 3. Phoenix Program. The Phoenix Program was a controversial counterinsurgency initiative run by U.S. and South Vietnamese forces during the Vietnam War. Lasting from 1965-1972, Phoenix coordinated intelligence operations and targeted killings aimed at neutralizing Viet Cong infrastructure and supporters. While Phoenix succeeded in inflicting damage, its methods involving interrogation, torture, and extrajudicial executions have also drawn intense criticism and scrutiny. Phoenix grew out of frustration over the failure to stem the rise of Viet Cong political cadres in rural areas. Phoenix aimed to improve coordination between policing, military, and intelligence agencies to identify and eliminate VC operatives more efficiently. Providing names and locations was incentivized, and efforts were made to penetrate VC ranks. Once suspects were seized, interrogation centers employed brutal techniques like beatings, electrocutions, and worse, trying to extract actionable intelligence. Captives often disappeared, presumed killed. Due process was ignored, as Phoenix ruthlessly pursued its mission outside the courts. The program's defenders argue it helped weaken VC political control wherever it operated. But refugees and prisoners report many innocent civilians got caught up in Phoenix's abrasive dragnets too. Brutality and unchecked authority led to abuse, generating fear and mistrust rather than populist loyalty. Number 2. Tet Offensive. The massive countrywide Tet Offensive launched by communist forces at the start of 1968 marked the turning point of the Vietnam War. The surprise attacks stunned the American public, contradicted optimistic assessments about U.S. progress, and convinced many that the lengthy conflict would not end quickly or easily, despite assurances given. Achieving total tactical surprise and contrary to the past behavior of only small hit-and-run engagements, the Communists coordinated attacks on over 100 cities and towns, including a raid on the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. The ambitious offensive aimed to foment a general uprising across South Vietnam. Caught initially off guard, U.S. and South Vietnamese troops managed to beat back the attacks after several days of intense urban combat. The Communists suffered devastating losses, failing to hold any areas they had seized. But sudden Communist boldness, coupled with the attack's sheer scale, shocked many observers. Although a tactical defeat for North Vietnam, the Tet Offensive proved an enormous strategic and psychological victory. It stoked massive anti-war sentiment in America, driving protests and weakening politicians' commitment to pursuing the conflict with no clear end point in sight. Tet became a turning point towards de-escalation. Number 1. Terrible loss of life. The costs of America's involvement in the Vietnam War were catastrophic, resulting in over 58,000 U.S. troops dead and over 150,000 wounded. North Vietnamese losses exceeded 1 million dead, with at least 200,000 South Vietnamese troops killed as well. The war's terrible toll of death and suffering left enduring scars on the Vietnamese nation and American society. Of the U.S. casualties that gave their lives in the conflict, the majority were younger conscripts, the average age being just 19 years old. Many other promising young lives were cut tragically short. Back home, the accumulation of casualties, flag-draped coffins, and funeral protests gradually eroded support for the war as families lost loved ones. Vietnam veterans came home wounded in body and mind, with enduring health issues from combat and toxic exposure. Friends they saw die before their eyes stayed with them permanently. Many struggled to readjust to civilian life after the nightmare of Vietnam. The veterans bore the burdens of service for years to come. In Vietnam, a generation grew up surrounded by death, mourning lost family members and living in the crossfire. Both civilian populations suffered immensely, from those killed in major combat operations to rural villagers caught underfoot or impacted by bombing campaigns and destruction that engulfed their homeland. The war brought unimaginable tragedy, loss permeating Vietnamese and American society alike. Recovering from the physical and psychological devastation would take decades, leaving deep scars. The appalling cost in lives and human potential serves as a reminder of war's immense capacity for inflicting suffering and the urgent need for peaceful alternatives. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.